Richard, Richard, Richard. How many Richards could one man possibly need? The answer is 3. The Kingdom of England had 3 Richards, for example. The French one that was here for like 40 minutes. The guy with the Princes in the Tower, the War of the Roses and the Battle of Bosworth. And then the second one. The Battle of Bosworth was very significant for our third and final Richard, as it marked his ultimate defeat and corpsation at the end of the Civil War, where he was finally slain in battle against a man from Pembroke, and unlike his Richardian fellows, was hastily buried in a churchyard in Leicester. Hundreds of years later, his sacred burial ground was replaced by a far more sanctified institution, a council car park. Finally, in 2012, he was located and exhumed from his tarmac grave in what was described by almost everyone as the world's worst game of Lucky Dip. Almost everyone. And he was eventually laid to rest in Leicester Cathedral. If you couldn't tell by my brief and uninformative history of Richard, and the other one, I don't care about Richard. I don't care about any of the Richards, because I've got something far more interesting. A king from Wales. Okay, hang on, don't leave. Llywelyn I of Gwynedd seized power at just 22 years old, and spent much of his career fighting both his fellow Welsh and the ever-encroaching English, much like his grandfather, his great-grandfather, his great-great-grandfather, and pretty much every ancestor for the previous 600 years. By 1234 he had greatly expanded his domain from where he was just 40 years prior, now titling himself the Prince of Aberfraw and the Lord of Eryri, and ultimately met the end of most people, dying in 1240, being remembered as Llywelyn Fawr, Llywelyn the Great. The reason I'm telling you this story is so that you know the gravity of this ruler. He was arguably one of, if not the most successful ruler in Wales ever, which makes it all the more unusual when you learn the circumstances of his burial. He was interred at Aberconwy Monastery, but that wouldn't last long. In 1282 his grandson would die in a surprisingly dubious event, and soon after the conquest of Wales would be complete, ending nearly 7 centuries of on and off warfare. The victor, the English King Edward I, almost immediately embarked on an extensive and expensive castle building project, spending the equivalent of over £60 million on 5 castles across North Wales, one of which he positioned at the strategic mouth of the River Conwy. Unfortunately, Aberconwy was sort of completely in the way. Not wanting to anger the church, Edward did the pious thing of demolishing and flattening the entire structure so that he could build his castle anyways, and built the monks a new monastery downstream, where they soon travelled to, carrying the coffin of Llywelyn Fawr. Edward attended the consecration of the building in the next year, but I'm not sure the monks felt it was a fair exchange. Their struggles wouldn't end there either, as 250 years later, during the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII, the son of that guy that killed Richard, the monks and Llywelyn's coffin would once again be forced to move downstream. The eternal stone grave of one of, if not Wales's most successful leaders, a man who went from a combatant on the River Conwy to a prince fending off the designs of the Welsh and the English, had to be disturbed one final time. At some point, however, for whatever reason, they decided to open the coffin. And inside, they found absolutely nothing. So, what happened here? Why did Llywelyn apparently just vanish into thin air? We can establish two facts first. He definitely died, no one's disputing that, and he was by all accounts buried under the altar at Aberconwy, a relatively new structure at the time of his death, but after that we can only speculate. Speculation 1. Edward. Of course, an obvious culprit you may be thinking of is Edward I, the king who defeated his grandson, who conquered his lands, and who built a castle over his burial ground. Is it unreasonable to believe that he, in some act of revenge against the man who fought so virulently against his father and grandfather, who helped the barons force the signature of the Magna Carta, destroyed or discarded the body? Sure, it'd be pretty horrific and extremely soul-damningly sacrilegious, but he did already pave over a church. However, the key point against this is that no one seems to have accused Edward of doing this, not the monks that were forced to move, nor the bards and gentry who had just lost their independence. If he wanted to destroy the body of a Christian king, it would have been pretty hard to do it in secret, and also strange to do it to the enemy of his grandfather, and not the Welsh ruler that he actually fought against in 1282. Not to mention the potential outrage in a country so rebel-prone that Edward spent a decade's worth of his income in fortifying the place. So I think we can confidently say he didn't destroy Llywelyn's body. He certainly didn't care about his church, but by all accounts, Llywelyn was in the coffin that travelled downstream to Meinan. That brings us to speculation 2. The possibility that it was lost during the transit, that Llywelyn somehow fell into the River Conwy. But I'm not confident about this one either. Firstly, he wasn't just transported on a sheet. The coffin he was supposed to be inside made the journey just fine, and again, no one at the time seems to have claimed this either. It feels like it would have been a pretty dramatic event, and the bards weren't known to shy away from such matters. Which brings us to our third and final speculation. This is my own personal theory, and like all of these, there is no evidence to prove it, but unlike the other two, there isn't anything to directly disprove it either. I propose that the monks may have reinterred Llywelyn in secret. While, like I said, I think it's very unlikely that Edward would have destroyed the corpse, he clearly didn't care much for the church's property. So what if the monks at Meinan believed that the king was no longer secure in his coffin? So they instead buried him somewhere in the grounds, keeping the location only to themselves. I think Edward's financing and later visit for the consecration could strengthen this idea. Perhaps they feared him or the potential sacrilege from a future English monarch, so hid his body away from the coffin and never told a soul. This also potentially could have happened at St. Grust's church after the monastery was dissolved. The motive then may have been even stronger, if they feared the government would come for more and more church land, property, and possessions, presumably including the dead bodies. However, the most interesting location in my opinion would be a hasty burial in the grounds of Aberconwy Monastery, before they ever relocated. You see, while the structure was flattened and a castle was built on top, some of the grounds outside did survive undeveloped for centuries, becoming the vicarage gardens you can see on this map. And I don't have any evidence for any of this. I don't have a source, a record, a hint, or a rumour, and sure, the whole thing is pretty unlikely. Perhaps the most reasonable option is that it was just lost, like most of the things I've discussed on this channel. I just think it would be really, really funny if the monks, not wanting to take Llywelyn from his burial place, put him in the nearby grounds that weren't going to be covered by Conwy Castle. Why? Well, wouldn't it be hilarious if this happened twice? Thank you for watching.